This is Twit. Bandwidth for Tech News Today is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Tech News Today, recorded on September 28th or December 29th, 2015.
Tech News Today is the show where we talk about the tech news with the journalists who report it. Welcome to the show. I'm Mike Elgan.
And I am Megan Morrone. For our special holiday shows, we'll be looking at some of the biggest and most controversial stories of the year.
Our interview guest today is Sarah Nahm, who's a former Google employee on the Chrome team and the founder and CEO of Lever, a San Francisco-based company that helps businesses hire great employees while retaining their culture and values. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We're really glad that you're here because this is a super important topic. Of course, we cover this in the news almost every day, all year. It's just a massive issue, especially this close to Silicon Valley. It's a big, big problem for Silicon Valley. Now, before we get into our conversation about diversity, can you tell us more about Lever?
Absolutely. Lever is a San Francisco-based startup that is disrupting a category of business software called the applicant tracking system, which traditionally provides a company with job applications, pipeline management, interview feedback. And Lever's modernizing that whole process with social and collaboration features that make hiring fundamentally more transparent and measurable within a company. And so our customers include Yelp, Lyft, Quora, Foursquare, Twitch, really hundreds of tech companies in Silicon Valley. And so that's really what's put us front and center to the diversity conversation and also what companies are doing about it. Because better hiring practices is really the biggest and most immediate part of the solution. And, of course, given kind of our position at the center of it all, we've gotten to see a lot of creative and innovative D&I practices, and we're putting that to action at Lever as we scale our own team. So at 44 employees, we're 50% minority and 36% women.
So you talk a little bit about like the signal to noise ratio when it comes to hiring. There's just so much noise. It's not that there aren't hires out there that are more diverse than what we're seeing, but it's just hard to find them. So can you tell us a little bit about how Lever works to combat that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a long time, the way companies hired, it was really based on sort of the people that applied on their careers pages. And something that Lever is doing that's fundamentally different is giving companies the tools they need to take control over the very top of the pipeline, the source of all the candidates, the people that are taking that very first step into kind of the hiring process. So we give, for example, every single person in the company the ability to proactively source people from social networks and professional networks just from one click from, a profile online. And so that really starts to give not just the recruiting team inside of a company, but every single employee the tool that they need to go out and proactively introduce people into the hiring process, to start the conversation about an open role, and to basically take back, I think, the very top of the funnel and let people, I think, start thinking beyond just the applicant pool when they're trying to solve their kind of talent strategy problems, and especially when it comes to diversity.
Now, people have probably heard the phrase the Rooney Rule as it's associated with diversity. Can you talk about what that is and how effective it is as a hiring practice?
Yeah, so the Rooney Rule was introduced to, of all places, the NFL by Dan Rooney, for whom the kind of rule is named. And it basically imposed a quota on the number of minority candidates that the NFL would consider for senior coaching and management roles. And, I think that the positive light on this was that within 10 years, this practice was able to increase the NFL's number of minority hires from 6 to 22%. But, it really did plateau after that decade. And so there's kind of mixed feelings on the efficacy of the practice. And so, of course, now this year has shown Facebook, Pinterest, a number of other companies announcing that they're adopting the Rooney Rule when they think about hiring for executive positions or even just any technical role around the company. So, I think what I like about tech companies adopting the Rooney Rule is that it's very measurable and concrete. And tech companies love taking action on things that are measurable and quantifiable. And so this is a really great first step to let tech companies do what they do best, which is, once they actually have a KPI, once they actually have a metric, holding themselves accountable to it. But it really is just one tool. And I think any company that thinks that they're really solving the diversity challenge just by implementing the Rooney Rule is really far from complete. I think that tech companies need more holistic approaches that go deeper into the company, and this includes, thinking about diversity and inclusion post-hire. It involves rolling out diversity initiatives to more people inside of the company. I think a lot of tech companies have, done great in terms of representing themselves to the press and to an external audience about what they're doing for diversity, but I'd love to see that commitment continue in thinking about what they're doing internally, what they're doing to really change the conversation for their employees and for people once they are hired.
Does Lever work with people post-hire? Like, do you work on mentorship programs or anything like that?
Well, I think that what's great is that we are, we're obviously more on the hiring side when it comes to the software, but given kind of our position at the center, as a center node in this entire ecosystem of recruitment, HR, and frankly, executives thinking about this problem, we're able to bring together a lot of our customers into kind of more of a community where they can actually discuss some of these issues and share best practices and learnings. So I think a lot of the value that we're offering completely independently of the software we're building for companies is just being kind of that connector, like helping people have more of a dialogue around what's working.
It's been interesting to cover Silicon Valley over the last few years because, of course, as you know, it wasn't until very recently when technology companies refused to give up their diversity numbers. And then once they did, we saw why they refused, because it's just horrible how whack the numbers are. But now, of course, all these companies are publishing, or most of them, publishing diversity reports, and then talking about how they're going to go about solving the problem of boosting diversity. So can you talk a little bit about how some of the bigger Silicon Valley companies, let's say Pinterest, Slack, Apple, and Facebook, how do companies like this differ in how they tackle diversity?
Well, this may be a controversial view, but I actually find that they don't differ all that much from each other. I think a lot of the companies that have made, that have made the headlines recently, they've mostly published their numbers and announced some commitments. They've probably started recruiting at specific colleges to introduce diversity. And I mean, in some cases, you see people rolling out training programs for their employees. I actually find that some of the more creative and diverse practices are actually coming from much smaller companies where from day one, they're prioritizing diversity and inclusion. And that's where you see this explosion of creativity and innovation at the smaller, more agile companies. I mean, take for an example, there's a company called NPM. It is a JavaScript tools company, so like building tools for a developer audience. And they have some of the more creative practices that I've ever seen. One, they've completely published a transparent candidate's guide to going through the interview process at NPM. And, I think another thing that they've done is really continue the diversity conversation way beyond your actual hiring. So they have what's called, a guys jar in the office, where if somebody ever accidentally says the word guys when they really mean people, the employee can voluntarily put $1 in the tip jar, which then just goes towards, funding other team programs they can do for diversity and inclusion initiatives. So I think to that point, there's just so much more that you can do rather than just publish numbers. And you can really bring it to life for people inside the company on an ongoing basis. And you see a lot more diversity approaches coming from all the different companies across the spectrum, whereas the companies that are already large, that already have inertia and momentum, they actually, I think, are less interesting in some sense in terms of the innovativeness of their practices.
You also talked about a program where they hired without using a resume. Was that successful? How did that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Another Lever customer is a mobile app company called KeepSafe. They're building an app to allow you to secure photos on your phone behind a passcode. The founders at KeepSafe, they decided to really sort of take a different approach to hiring in Silicon Valley. As a lot of people know, it's extremely competitive, and finding a way to stand out from the crowd can sometimes be tricky. So KeepSafe decided both to help them attract a different kind of hire, like looking explicitly beyond kind of the pedigree of your former company or your former school, but also as a way to introduce, a different kind of diversity into their developer hires. They officially started the no resume campaigns. There's actually a website too that you can check out, but they basically decided, forget it. We don't need to see your resume. We actually just need to hear about something you're proud of, a project that you built. Write a paragraph describing that project and why you're excited about it. They had that up for a couple weeks, had over 400 applicants that would otherwise probably never have heard of KeepSafe who applied, and whittled that down to a hire that they're really proud to say, probably would not have been somebody that, would have made it through a traditional hiring process, but because of the passion and clearly the skill with which he described kind of his work, they were able to pick him out from the crowd.
Now, did they use his name or anything, or was it just purely this written document?
Yeah, it was absolutely just the way that he talked about his work.
So they had no idea what ethnicity he was or whether he was he or she.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
I built a clock in high school and I got arrested, and I'm really proud of that. Someday that's going to be a story that they will tell, and they'll probably get hired. Sarah, now, of course, a lot of these CEOs who have been talking a lot about diversity, I think the most recent was YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki at the Dreamforce conference. She basically said that, hey, I'm hiring women, and expressed some frustration at the availability of women, for example, to hire. Now, this is obviously a deep cultural issue. How much of the blame do you think goes to the creators or arbiters of culture, such as Hollywood, in music videos, in movies and television shows? Are we not putting enough of an emphasis on on Hollywood and too much on Silicon Valley? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that go into kind of the steps leading up to hiring, right? I mean, in many ways, people trace back the diversity pipeline through the education system, through high school students. Really people are looking at a lot of different social and cultural factors that lead up to the available population of technical people that you might hire from. And, I think that specifically on the topic of Hollywood, there's definitely, a myth out there. There's a myth that, I'd say the hacker stereotype and sort of, what cinematic portrayals of sort of Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs kind of propagates, which is that, the definition of success in Silicon Valley is somebody who's wearing sneakers and a hoodie and who kind of trades off their time between programming and playing video games. And I think, frankly, that does a disservice, not just to women or to minorities, but frankly, to the diversity of what it means to be an entrepreneur that I even see amongst, the white males in Silicon Valley. So I think, it's probably similar to how, NASA scientists feel when they see how, rocket scientists are portrayed in cinema. But so I don't know that there's something unique to, specifically computer science as it's portrayed in the media. But I do think that, the way that we as kind of a culture define success could really be more specific and more precise. I mean, I think that this actually ties right back into Susan at Dreamforce this past year, in the sense that, the way people, I think, talk about success, the way they define people's accomplishments, I mean, this just has to be something that is a little bit more sophisticated and refined than where we're at today. I think every time somebody in kind of the media talks about, focuses on women as being a balance of work life and home life, they're propagating the same stereotypes that are potentially just as harmful as when Hollywood just portrays, a hacker as being sort of a white teenage male.
I mean, there's also just so much unconscious bias, I think, and just you brought this up in an interview that I read about how people, when they're hiring, they say, I just want someone from Stanford who worked at Google. And just saying that, they don't realize that they're already limiting that's already a very non-diverse population. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this goes to one of, I think, the most harmful areas of diversity in Silicon Valley hiring, which is a focus on pedigree. And pedigree is interesting because it actually has sort of a sense of objectivity or kind of like measurement to it because it focuses on past experience. However, pedigree is really just a way that you can also essentially bake in the practices of other organizations into your own hiring. So if you, for example, are really excited about hiring former Google employees, this then creates a situation where you're implicitly privileging the people that made it past Google's diversity practices in hiring. And you're also, subtly filtering against people that wouldn't have gotten hired at Google based on their, hiring practices. And so in that sense, I think that a lot of the companies that I work with, we do a lot to help them define what specifically they're looking to fill in the role. What, it is that, how can they invest in having a more precise definition of what it really means to succeed inside of their companies? Because sort of the tempting, but I think ultimately, kind of reinforcing, nature of reinforcing the status quo. It's really unfortunate for companies who, just think about going with all these folks who have already had, privilege in the past at all these other organizations and just building in that same unconscious bias into their own teams.
I believe that the self-reinforcing nature of the diversity problem is probably most acute in the world of venture capital and funding startups. Essentially, I think there have been some reports and studies that have found that what venture capitalists are looking for is people just like themselves. They're basically trying to find mini-me's and clones of themselves, white or Asian males who went to Stanford, et cetera, et cetera. And so the money is oftentimes biased toward startups that have founders, of course, and then you have this situation where all the founders are white or Asian males, very common in Silicon Valley, very, very common, and those are like closed meetings, and the voodoo for deciding what's which startups to back is very sort of inaccessible to outside influences. So how does Silicon Valley as a business culture, as a culture in general, break past the all-important funding issue when this self-reinforcing hiring phenomenon takes the form of actual dollars and cents? How do we get at that part of the problem?
Yeah, I think you're really getting to the heart of a lot of these issues, which is just, again, reinforcing diversity in the definition of success, and nowhere is that more important than kind of at the very top of the food chain with, what companies get founded and who are those people at the very top leadership positions. It's interesting because, prior to me entering the world of startups, prior to me founding Lever and subsequently raising, 2 rounds of funding so far, I was a little bit of a skeptic about diversity in tech, because in my day-to-day life, I saw diversity on my own teams at Google. I felt that, while women and minorities certainly weren't the majority, things were trending upwards in a great and positive direction. And then when I started actually getting a lot more exposure to the venture capital community, to this kind of other layer of Silicon Valley, I did start to feel like a minority. I went to countless meetings where I was the only woman, was kind of working with a lot of different venture capital firms where, I always felt respected and I always felt like people were very courteous and were professional, but couldn't help but feel that, literally, I wasn't represented in that group. And, I think that when I really look at venture capital in general, the thing that I think is so interesting is some of the unspoken ways that success is measured and where these people are sort of looking to kind of found their decisions when they're trying to make an investment. So on the one hand, I found that confidence really matters. And I think confidence is a stereotypically male attribute. And it's really interesting to see maybe, how, how venture capital firms can be a little bit more self-aware about the unconscious bias about confidence within sort of their decision-making. But I think a little bit more concretely, venture capital is a field based on data and based on analytics. And something that's interesting about any field that's based on analytics is the fact that people are looking for a pattern match. And so until there's enough data that points to a pattern of success built around women and minority-owned startups, you may find it hard to make a case amongst such an analytical audience as venture capital investors about how you prove that doing something different doesn't pose a financial risk. So I think that is something that I'm seeing a lot of venture capital firms become more mindful of, that they can't just continue to pattern match against really kind of superficial data sets that just don't include actually diversity in it. And I'm actually seeing a lot more folks approach me, at least from the VC community, who are really excited about changing the dialogue, about introducing more women into their portfolio, more minorities into their portfolio. So I think even if it's lagging behind in terms of literally representation, I think that venture capital is catching up pretty quickly to the conversation, to the tone, and to basically next steps about what they can do about it.
Yeah, and I think it's a super important issue because, of course, I think that a lot of people who have not gone through the whole fundraising process, who have not worked in a Silicon Valley startup, don't quite understand the huge disparity in power and influence within a startup between the founders and everybody else. A typical scenario, there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 founders. They'll go in, they'll get funded, they're the anointed founders, and then the company grows to have a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 or 4 or 5 dozen employees. The value based on how the allocation of stock works and all the rest of it between those founders and everybody else is just night and day. One of the founders is worth all the non-founders put together in every case. They are massively more powerful internally within those companies than your typical CEO at a large company as compared to the rank and file employees. It's a really major issue to have. And so, of course, when there's pressure to add diversity, they'll throw some female and minority faces in there, but they have no, they don't have the power of a founder. And so I think it's really important that that women and minorities are actually funded as founders. There have been some efforts to, for example, there are some venture firms that specialize in funding all women startups, for example. Are those proving to be successful, do you think?
I don't actually know very much about the results coming out of those programs, but I can tell you that the conversation really fundamentally changes. I think that a lot of these organizations within tech that are trying to specifically speak to a women-focused audience at all levels of kind of the value chain, whether it's funding or all the way down to Hackbright, which is sort of giving developers an intensive boot camp for going from 0 to getting their first job as a software engineer. I think it really changes the community, the momentum, the results that you're able to get, because you're just kind of, in a way, by focusing entirely on women, taking gender out of the equation. You're giving people an environment where it's a non-issue what gender you are, because specifically acknowledging that everybody sort of around you is exactly in the same position. So I think that the emphasis on funding more female companies is one that I hope spreads to many VC firms, and is one that is hardly locked up in just a few VC firms that make it a specific issue. I do think that it's a really great way for, I think, like the topic to get out there more, for there to be more lightning rods and kind of like starting points for attracting more female-founded companies to Silicon Valley. And I'm mostly just excited for what it would unlock in terms of the visibility and the, I think, like, results that you'll be able to see in just a couple years after they've done this for a while.
Well, I think in this discussion we've we've used the term diversity, but I think we're talking sometimes about women and sometimes about cultural diversity, or we're talking about, we're saying minorities. And that's what I've heard a lot of complaints about when people just say, we want to hire more women and more minorities. And, people who are women and minorities feel sometimes left out of the question. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the definition of diversity in tech, it's a very far-reaching thing. I think obviously women and kind of like racial minorities have been probably leading the way, but I think that a lot of organizations are broadening their definition of, inclusivity when it comes to, sexual orientation with regards to maternity, paternity leave. People are broadening their definition of diversity when it comes to, I think pedigree, former company and former school. People are also acknowledging that, the sort of stereotypes that we had in the early days of tech about the disposition or work style or communication style that you were meant to have if you were a technical person, if you were a leader, if you were a hacker, if you were, basically any of these sort of roles that you associate with tech. I think people are really broadening the definition of what it means to have a diverse working environment, working population. And at Lever, we even talk about it on a ton of levels. We focus actually quite a lot on our team on, making sure that, the technical, non-technical divide is not one that actually is, making anybody feel like a minority or feel unincluded. I do a lot of work within our organization to make sure that there's no one part of our org that is, leading the way or sort of making all the decisions, because I view sort of the diversity of function as being yet another way that you could approach the diversity topic. So I do think that, we're still in the early days, and there's going to be a lot of work to be done to just address diversity on some of the most fundamental levels like gender and race. But I do think that if there's any organization that's actually, or if there's any sector, any industry that's evolving the diversity topic beyond race and gender, it is actually the tech industry, which I feel really excited and optimistic about.
Well, speaking of women in general specifically, what do you say to people who say, when we're talking about just pure engineering jobs or technical jobs, people who just say there aren't enough women who are getting STEM degrees, they're just not getting into the field, there's not enough for us to hire, and that's why we haven't hired them? What do you say to someone who says that?
Yeah, well, education is definitely part of the pipeline, but it's actually not the sole solution. Computer science grads, STEM grads, they hardly represent the entire pool of qualified talent, and companies shouldn't see it that way. Today, a CS degree doesn't even guarantee that you have the relevant skills to keep up with the rapid pace of web, mobile, and tech developments. And in some sense, the most important skill is to be able to learn, so that when a new programming language or mobile OS or app framework comes out, you're actually able to pick it up. So companies, I'd say, if they are looking for one concrete thing to do to, basically improve diversity in their hiring pipeline, it's to not focus on CS degrees. There has been a massive explosion in the ways that people can learn the skills required for today's tech challenges. And you can absolutely learn to code online and through online courses like those offered by Coursera or Khan Academy. And then there's so many developer boot camps like Hack Reactor, Maker Square, and Hackbright that are churning out thousands of entry-level developers each year. At my company, at Lever, we've hugely benefited from the alternate education and career pathways available today. Out of the 18 people on our technical team, only 2 have traditional CS degrees, and notably 3 are graduates from the new generation of developer boot camps, including some of our women engineers. So I'm really excited, I think, about the potential for people to take ownership over the top of the pipelines, even if, the STEM degrees, the percentage of women graduating from STEM degrees doesn't change, because there's just so many more options out there when you're looking for, seasoned and qualified talent.
Are you bothered by the what could be an overemphasis on diversity reports? if you're a casual consumer of the technology news, you've heard a lot about diversity reports, and basically the way it works is that the Silicon Valley companies are sort of publishing these diversity reports and saying, oh, here are our numbers, here's how it compares to last year, we've increased the number of women by 1%, et cetera, et cetera. Are you concerned that that's a far too blunt instrument to be overly obsessed by? And just let me tell you some of the concerns that I've heard out there. One of them, for example, is that everybody's shoehorned into these very broad categories, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and then there's this other category. So if you're a Native American, right, you're in the other category. Nobody is pressuring Facebook to increase their other employees. You know what I mean? There's no pressure. There's homosexuals. There's all kinds of different elements to diversity that are not even touched. The other problem with diversity reports might be, what is the mix that you're actually trying to achieve? For example, I think it would be reasonable to say, okay, we want a company to reflect the actual diversity of the place where it is. But where is a company? For example, should a Silicon Valley-based company reflect the diversity numbers in the United States generally? Should it be California generally? Should it be the Bay Area generally? What is the yardstick against which we measure diversity numbers when we, it's not a problem now because we're so far away from those targets, but once we get closer, we have to understand what the target is. Anyway, I'm just curious about your thoughts about diversity reports as something for everybody to obsess about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it goes without saying, I appreciate what the diversity reports do, which is give a little bit more transparency and accountability into a problem that's, I think, historically been really locked up inside of these companies. But I do have a couple criticisms, I think, about diversity reports, and hopefully, I think there is a path forward from here. One criticism is that I think that reports like these are really a lagging indicator, right? It may be years before you're really kind of moving far enough upstream or making changes with enough time kind of in place to actually see the results. And so in many ways, like patting a company kind of on the back because they've released a diversity report, well, that's not even kind of like asked them or held them to the standards of really approaching the underlying issues that create those numbers. And I think too much focus on the true, like very, very end results is frankly distracting people from really the source of a lot of these problems. I think a second criticism is that I kind of feel that a lot of the diversity reports are really done for an external audience. It's sort of taking pressure that journalists kind of add onto the companies or kind of like just the external public and trying to respond to what those people want to see from a company. However, what are companies doing to actually build greater transparency within their own organizations? Where are they giving their employees the accountability that they deserve about being able to track and hold accountable their own kind of like internal initiatives and, understanding, the way the leadership is really trending in terms of the commitments that they may make internally. To that point, I think it would be great to see companies start to do a couple more things. In addition to publishing their diversity stats once a year, it'd be great if they actually established real-time, up-to-the-minute dashboards for employees to understand, the numbers that they have, the numbers that are kind of reflective of the employee base in real time and more frequently than once a year. Also, I think like a lot of tech companies are publishing their pipelines for hiring, but are companies publishing their pipelines for internal promotions, for the way that people are getting recognized and rewarded within the company? I think that there's so much more to the story when you start broadening it out from just what an external journalism or an external press audience is interested in versus what people who are really inside of your company and inside of your culture, what they would want to hear about.
So you talked about how a lot of your clients are small. They're small companies. They're still flexible, and they can do these things. They can make these hires. Is there anything that you see small companies doing that big companies could do, or even companies that aren't tech companies could do that they're just not doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of practices that I think are working really well for a lot of companies. And in many ways, it can apply to people of all scale and sizes. I think some concrete steps that you can make to improve the diversity of your hiring pipeline, there's a couple things there. I mean, one is to remove gendered language from your job postings. This is something that we've seen, relatively small startup called Buffer tackle recently, where they noticed that on job postings that had the word hacker in it, it actually had fewer than 2% female applicants. Once they sort of corrected that, used alternate language that was a little bit more gender neutral and didn't have quite the male white hacker stereotype, they actually saw the rate of women applicants go up.
What is the gender neutral word for hacker?
Not hacker.
Yeah, I think that there's so many words: engineer, architect, developer, lots of things that a lot more women self-identify with than this, Hollywood stereotype of the hacker. I mean, we've even seen, at Lever, we've taken this kind of advice to heart, and we've actually built a tool internally. One of our software engineers did this at a hackathon, where she parsed out the language from our job postings and analyzed them for agentive, stereotypically male and aggressive words, versus communal, stereotypically female adjectives and nouns, and just ran an analysis on all of our job postings. And, we actually discovered that, literally on our postings that had more agentive adjectives and nouns, we also had more male applicants. So it's interesting now that we take great care to neutralize the language in our job postings, because if you're going to solve the diversity problem, you shouldn't be cutting off the diversity at the very, very top of your applicant pool. Some more advice, I think, is to explicitly train your interviewers on unconscious bias. We do this here at Lever, and I think that Facebook has done a really fantastic kind of contribution by open sourcing their unconscious bias training to the world. And then I think the most important thing, and oftentimes the most difficult for people, including Lever's customers, is to invest more time and energy into defining what makes a great hire, and removing culture fit as a reason not to hire someone. The reason it's hard to do is because it really requires a lot more work and energy internally within the company. You're not just copy pasting a job description from a competitor's careers page. You're actually taking the time to really think through what this role is, what you're looking for, and also to socialize that throughout the organization. It's sort of a difficult process when you start actually trying to focus on defining success for yourself within your company, within your team. But it goes kind of really far in terms of making sure that you as an organization are defining kind of like your kind of cultural fit from a standpoint that is a little bit more oriented around impact, results, and a little bit, therefore, more fair and objective.
All right. Well, Sarah Nahm is at lever.co, and you can find her on Twitter at SRHNHM. That's Sarah Nahm without the vowels. Sarah, I want to thank you so much for coming on Tech News Today and talking with us about your area of expertise, or one of your areas of expertise, which is diversity in hiring, etc. Thank you so much for coming on Tech News Today.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Thanks for coming on. You can subscribe to Tech News Today at twit.tv/TNT. You can also watch us live every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1700 UTC at twit.tv/live. And if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, come on in and watch us as part of our studio audience. You can send an email to tickets@twit.tv. You can follow us on Twitter. That's Tech News Today TV.
And that is the Tech News Today. This show was produced by Jason Clianthus. We're Mike Elgan and Megan Morrone. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.